In early 1968, a Viet Cong ambush team leader named Phong spent 4 days preparing a killing ground along a trail his scouts swore an American patrol used every single week. The patrol never came. He had done everything correctly. His scouts had watched the trail for a month, logging every American movement through that stretch of jungle, building a pattern reliable enough to plan an entire operation around. The same platoon, the same rough time of day, the same general route week after week. The way patrols in that valley had always moved because a trail is a trail, and a trail connects one place to another by the shortest, most sensible path. Phong had positioned his men along exactly the stretch his scouts had identified, dug in, patient, certain the Americans would walk into the exact ground he had chosen for them. They did not walk into it. They did not walk anywhere near it. When contact finally came, 3 days later, it came from a completely different direction, along ground Fong's team had never prepared and never expected, catching 2 of his own scouts in the open instead. Phong pulled his men out that night, furious and confused in roughly equal measure. It took him weeks of careful listening and comparing notes with other unit leaders before he understood what had actually happened to his month of patient observation. The Americans had stopped walking the same trail twice, not occasionally, not when it was convenient, as a matter of deliberate, enforced discipline. A unit that had used a route once simply did not use it again for a long stretch of time afterward. No matter how much sense that route made, no matter how much easier it would have been to simply walk the path that already existed. Phong could not know the name of the officer who had first insisted on this discipline, or how many arguments it must have taken to convince tired, footsore men that the longer, harder route was worth the extra effort every single time. He knew only that his month of patient reconnaissance had produced a pattern that no longer existed by the time he was ready to use it. That is the story of the discipline that broke the ambush before it was ever sprung. Now let me show you exactly what it took to maintain it. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why refusing to walk the same trail twice was so devastating to an ambush team, you first have to understand exactly what an ambush actually depends on before the first shot is ever fired. To understand why route discipline mattered so much, you have to understand that an ambush is not, at its core, a moment of violence. It is the end product of a much longer process, and that process depends entirely on one specific resource that has nothing to do with weapons at all: prediction. An ambush team cannot simply wait anywhere and hope the enemy walks past. Preparing a killing ground properly takes real time, sighting weapons for interlocking fields of fire, cutting lanes through vegetation, rehearsing the sequence of the attack, positioning men where they can strike hard and disengage cleanly afterward. This preparation is only worth doing if the ambush team has real confidence about where the enemy will actually be. That confidence has to come from somewhere. It comes from watching, from patient observation, sometimes over days or weeks, building up a picture of an enemy unit's habits, reliable enough to bet an entire operation on. This is why terrain itself so often decided where ambushes happened. A trail exists because it is the easiest way to get from one place to another, and easiest routes get used again and again by anyone moving through that ground for the same simple reasons that made the trail worth cutting in the first place. An enemy unit patrolling out of a base camp or moving between 2 points it visited regularly would naturally gravitate toward the same handful of practical routes because those routes were, quite simply, the sensible way to travel. A patient observer watching that same stretch of ground over time did not need any special insight to notice the pattern. The pattern announced itself plainly to anyone willing to watch long enough. Picture a scout doing exactly this kind of patient work because it is unglamorous, invisible, labor that rarely gets told as its own story. He lies in cover near the same stretch of trail, day after day, at roughly the same hours, and writes down what he sees, A patrol crosses at mid-morning on the third day. Another crosses at a similar hour 4 days later. He begins to sense a rhythm before he can prove it, and he keeps watching, patient in exactly the way this whole channel has described elsewhere, because the pattern he is building will only be trustworthy if he resists the urge to act on it too early. And once that pattern was established, an ambush team held an enormous advantage. It knew, with real confidence, not just roughly where the enemy would be, but often approximately when and from which direction, and moving at what pace. That knowledge let a small, lightly armed force achieve something it could never achieve in a fair, symmetrical fight. Total surprise, delivered at a time and place of its own choosing, against an enemy who had no idea the encounter was coming until the first shots were already landing. The entire devastating effectiveness of ambush warfare rested on this foundation of prediction, built patiently, trail by trail, pattern by pattern over time. Now understand exactly what the Americans did to deny Fong's side that foundation, because the tactic itself was almost disappointingly simple to describe, even though it was genuinely difficult to actually maintain. The rule, in its plainest form, was this: a unit that had moved along a particular route recently did not use that same route again for a meaningful stretch of time afterward. If a patrol had walked a trail out to a checkpoint on Monday, it did not walk the same trail back on Monday, and it did not use that same trail again the following week either, even if the trail remained, by any practical measure, the easiest and most sensible way to make the same journey. Units were trained and expected to vary their routes deliberately, to approach familiar objectives from unfamiliar directions, and to treat any route that had become routine as a route that had become dangerous, regardless of how convenient it remained. This sounds simple stated as a rule, and it is worth being honest about how difficult it actually was to follow and practice day after day for the length of an entire combat tour. The easy route existed because it was easy. Choosing a harder route instead meant longer movements, more exhausting terrain, more time spent exposed in the open, more physical cost paid by tired men who already carried heavy loads through brutal heat and difficult ground. Every single time a unit chose the harder, less familiar path instead of the trail that already existed, it was accepting a real, immediate cost in exchange for a benefit that could not be seen or measured in the moment. You cannot point to the ambush that did not happen. You can only feel the extra miles in your legs every single day and trust that the discipline was worth it. Picture the actual decision made over and over by a squad leader planning a routine patrol. The map shows an obvious route, the trail his unit used 2 weeks ago, easy, direct, already cut through the vegetation by prior use. He also knows the rule, and he knows his own unit's recent movement history well enough to recognize that this particular trail is exactly the kind of route that should now be avoided. So he plots a different path, one that will cost his men an extra hour of hard movement through terrain that has not been walked recently. He accepts the complaints this decision will generate because the alternative is walking his men into exactly the kind of predictable pattern that an ambush team like Fong's was specifically watching for. This discipline, multiplied across an entire unit's operational history, made the enemy's patient observation dramatically less useful than it had once been. A scout watching American movement in a given area no longer saw a reliable pattern emerge because the pattern was being deliberately, systematically denied to him. He might see a unit use a particular route once and prepare to exploit that same route the following week, only to find the Americans somewhere else entirely, moving through ground his own preparation had never anticipated at all. It would be too simple to present this discipline as a clean, cost-free solution because maintaining it demanded real and ongoing sacrifice from the men actually walking those routes, and that cost deserves to be told honestly. The physical toll was immediate and constant. Choosing unfamiliar, more difficult terrain over an established trail meant longer movements, more exhausting effort, and greater exposure to the countless smaller dangers of moving through unbroken jungle rather than a path other men had already cleared. Men carrying heavy packs, weapons, and ammunition through terrain nobody had recently walked paid for that discipline in exhaustion, in twisted ankles, in the countless small physical costs of choosing the harder path deliberately again and again for the entire length of a combat tour that already demanded enormous physical endurance from every man in it. Picture the actual physical experience of one of these harder movements, because it is easy to describe the rule and forget what it felt like to live inside it. A squad pushes through waist-high undergrowth that has not been cut by anyone recently, sweat soaking through uniforms within minutes, thorns and vines catching on packs and equipment, the pace slowing to a fraction of what the same distance would have taken on a cleared trail. A man near the back mutters, not for the first time, that there was a perfectly good path 50 meters to their left the whole time. Nobody argues the point because everybody knows it is true. They keep moving anyway because the discipline does not bend for a bad day or a tired unit or the simple, reasonable temptation to take the easier way just this once. There was a psychological cost too, one that is easy to overlook but genuinely significant. Soldiers naturally develop comfort with familiar ground. A trail walked before is a trail with fewer unknown surprises, a route where a man has already noted the difficult stream crossing, the steep section, the spot where visibility opens up. Deliberately avoiding familiar routes meant deliberately choosing unfamiliar ground again and again, and unfamiliar ground carries its own quiet unease, its own low-grade uncertainty that never fully goes away, no matter how experienced a unit becomes at operating this way. Men had to learn to live with that constant, low-level discomfort as simply the price of doing the job correctly. And there was a real cost in time and coordination as well. Varying routes deliberately required more planning, more careful map work, more communication up and down the chain of command to ensure that route variation was actually happening in a genuine, unpredictable way rather than settling into its own new, equally exploitable pattern. A unit that always varied its routes in the same predictable manner had not actually solved the problem. It had simply created a more complicated version of the same vulnerability, and avoiding that trap required real, ongoing attention from leaders who had to think carefully about genuine unpredictability rather than simply congratulating themselves for not using yesterday's trail. This is worth stating plainly because the discipline only worked when it was maintained consistently by every unit over the entire length of an operation without exception. A single unit that grew complacent, that returned to a familiar route out of simple fatigue or convenience on one particular afternoon, could undo months of careful unpredictability in a single decision. The tactic demanded not just individual discipline, but institutional discipline, enforced from command down through every squad leader, sustained against the constant, entirely understandable pull toward the easier path that existed, waiting every single day. Picture the actual enforcement of this, because a rule like this does not maintain itself. A company commander reviewing patrol logs after the fact, cross-referencing routes against a map marked with recent movement, catching a squad leader who had quietly reverted to a familiar trail out of simple exhaustion on a bad week. The conversation that followed was not gentle. It could not afford to be, because a single lapse multiplied across enough tired units over enough weeks, would have quietly rebuilt exactly the pattern the whole discipline existed to prevent. Some officers kept their own private records of unit movement specifically to check this, treating route repetition as seriously as any other lapse in field discipline, because they understood, in a way that took real institutional memory to sustain, that the cost of one convenient shortcut might not be paid by the squad that took it, but by whichever unit walked that same ground next. Understanding the effect this had on Fong's side requires walking through exactly how it disrupted the entire process an ambush team depended on, because the damage went far beyond simply making individual ambushes harder to plan. The most immediate effect was the collapse of confident prediction, where an ambush team had once been able to invest days or weeks of patient observation into a plan with real confidence of success. That same investment now carried genuine uncertainty. A pattern observed today might simply not exist by the time preparations were complete, because the very act of observation had been anticipated and specifically defeated by the discipline this story describes. This did not make ambushes impossible. It made them dramatically more expensive to plan reliably, because the foundation of confident prediction that had once made careful preparation worthwhile was no longer nearly as trustworthy as it had once been. Think about the specific calculation this forced onto a man like Fong, planning his next operation after the failure that opened the story. He could still watch American movement, and he could still identify apparent patterns in what he observed, but he now had to weigh that observation against a real possibility that the pattern would not hold by the time he was ready to act on it. And that possibility changed the entire risk calculation behind committing days of preparation and positioning to a single specific plan. Some ambush teams responded by shortening their preparation time, accepting less certainty in exchange for acting faster before a pattern had time to dissolve. Others responded by preparing multiple contingencies rather than a single confident plan, spreading the same effort across several possible outcomes instead of concentrating it on one high-confidence opportunity. Picture what this actually meant for a scout's morale over time, because the erosion was slow and cumulative rather than sudden. He had built his entire professional identity around the value of patient watching, the belief that careful observation, sustained long enough, would always eventually reveal something usable. Now he watched, and sometimes the pattern he built dissolved before he ever got to use it, and he began to carry a new and unfamiliar doubt into work that had once felt reliably productive. Was the pattern he was seeing real, or was it an illusion that would simply vanish the way the last one had? That doubt, small at first, spread through the whole discipline of reconnaissance on his side, changing not just the tactics, but the confidence with which those tactics were pursued. And there was a deeper, more corrosive effect that went beyond any single operation. Ambush warfare done well depends on the ambusher's confidence, the sense that patient, careful work reliably produces results, that watching and waiting is worthwhile because the enemy's habits can genuinely be learned and exploited. American route discipline undermined that confidence directly, introducing a persistent uncertainty into a form of warfare that had always depended on the opposite. That doubt spread across an entire fighting force over months and years, changed how ambush teams approached their planning at a fundamental level, forcing a shift toward faster, less confident operations that could not extract the same value from patient reconnaissance that had once made ambush warfare so devastatingly effective. Picture two unit leaders comparing notes at a rear position months after Fong's own failure, trading stories that had by then become depressingly familiar to both of them. One describes a pattern watched for 3 weeks, abandoned the moment preparations began, the Americans simply never returning to the ground his scouts had so carefully mapped. The other describes something worse, a pattern that seemed to hold an operation launched with real confidence and an empty position, because the unit being watched had, for reasons neither man could ever fully reconstruct, chosen that particular week to break its own routine. They did not conclude the Americans were lucky. They concluded slowly, over many such conversations, that luck had nothing to do with it, and that the entire craft they had spent years mastering was being deliberately, systematically undermined by a discipline neither of them had a name for yet. It would be a disservice to the honest history of that war to present route discipline as a complete solution to the ambush problem, because it was never that. And the enemy's real skill and adaptability deserve full acknowledgement in this story. The discipline could reduce the reliability of the specific kind of pattern-based ambush this story describes, but it could not eliminate ambush warfare entirely. Viet Cong and NVA units continued to conduct effective ambushes throughout the war using methods that did not depend entirely on long-term route observation. Some ambushes were opportunistic, sprung against whatever target happened to present itself in generally favorable terrain, requiring no advance pattern at all. Others were triggered by intelligence gathered through different channels entirely, informants, captured documents, or direct observation of a specific operation already underway rather than a long-term pattern built from repeated route use. Route discipline addressed one specific vulnerability. It did not address every way an ambush could be planned and executed. And the enemy adapted, the way any capable adversary adapts to a persistent countermeasure. Some units learned to watch not for a specific route pattern, but for broader patterns in timing, or, in the general areas a unit tended to operate within, patterns that route variation alone could not fully disguise. Scouts became more patient, extending their observation periods to distinguish genuine random variation from patterns that were simply harder to detect. Picture what this counter-adaptation actually looked like, because it shows the contest did not simply end with the Americans holding a permanent advantage. A patient observer, instead of watching a single trail for a few weeks, extended his observation across an entire operational area for months, tracking not specific routes, but the general rhythm of a unit's activity, which days it tended to patrol, roughly which direction its patrols tended to favor, even when the specific paths varied, how far from its base it typically ranged. This was slower, harder work than the old method, and it produced less precise results. But it produced something, and something was often enough to plan around, even if it could no longer promise the near certainty that patient observation had once delivered. The honest picture, then, is of a real and significant tactical advantage, purchased at real and ongoing physical and psychological cost that meaningfully degraded but never eliminated one specific form of enemy planning. It saved lives, and it forced the enemy toward less reliable and less devastating forms of ambush warfare than the fully pattern-based version this story opened with. It did not, by itself, win the war, and units that maintained the discipline perfectly still faced ambushes, still took casualties, still fought an enemy who remained skilled, patient, and genuinely dangerous throughout the entire conflict. Fong survived the war, and in the years afterward, he thought often about that failed operation and about what it had actually taught him regarding the nature of the enemy he had spent years fighting. He came to understand that the failure had not been a failure of his own scouts' diligence in the way he first assumed in his anger immediately afterward. His scouts had done genuinely careful, patient work, and the pattern they had identified had been real, accurately observed, and reasonably reliable at the moment they identified it. What had defeated him was not a mistake on his side, but a specific, deliberate discipline on the other side, one built entirely around denying him the one resource his entire method of warfare depended on. He had not been outfought. He had been outplanned by an enemy willing to pay a real, ongoing cost in comfort and convenience, specifically to deny him something he had never before had to fight to obtain. He thought, too, about the sheer institutional discipline this must have required to maintain, because he understood, better than most, exactly how hard it was to sustain any unpopular practice across an entire fighting force for the length of a long war. Individual soldiers, individual squad leaders, individual units all had to choose the harder path again and again, accepting real physical costs for a benefit they could never directly observe or confirm. He came to respect this discipline in a way that had nothing to do with liking the men who maintained it, the same professional respect he had learned to extend to other difficult, hard-won achievements on the other side of that long war. He remembered in particular trying to explain the failed operation to a younger scout years later, and how difficult it was to make the lesson land. The younger man wanted a tactical fix, a specific countermeasure he could apply the next time he watched a trail. Fong found himself unable to offer one because the actual lesson was not a tactic at all. It was a warning about trusting patience too completely, about remembering that the enemy might be watching his own watching, adjusting to defeat exactly the kind of careful work Fong had once been so proud of. The younger scout looked unsatisfied with an answer that offered no clean solution, and Fong understood that feeling completely because he had felt exactly the same dissatisfaction himself for weeks before he finally accepted that some problems in that war did not have tidy answers. And he came, eventually, to a broader understanding of what this particular contest revealed about the entire war he had fought. Some advantages, he came to believe, were not about better weapons or greater numbers at all. They were about which side was willing to pay a small, unglamorous, constant cost day after day in exchange for a benefit that could never be directly measured or celebrated. His own side had built an entire war strategy around exactly this kind of patient, unglamorous discipline, sustained over years, rather than displayed in any single dramatic moment. It was strange and in its own way instructive to discover that his enemy had learned to fight the same way in this one narrow but significant respect. Here is what Fong finally understood about the ambush that never happened, and why the discipline behind it mattered more than any single failed operation. An ambush, at its heart, is a bet on prediction, built patiently from the accumulated evidence of an enemy's habits, and for a very long time in that war, that bet paid off reliably, because trails exist for good reasons and armies, like anyone else, tend to use the easiest path available to them. Fong's side had built real skill and real success around exploiting exactly this tendency, watching patiently, preparing carefully, and striking with total surprise against an enemy who had, without quite realizing it, made himself predictable simply by doing the sensible thing again and again. The discipline that defeated him was not a weapon, and it was not a clever trick discovered in a single moment of insight. It was a choice, made and remade thousands of times, by tired men who had every reason to want the easier path and chose the harder one instead, specifically because the harder path denied an enemy they could not see the one thing his entire method of warfare required. That is a much less dramatic story than a battle won by superior firepower or superior numbers, and it is, in its own way, a more impressive one, because it asked something from ordinary soldiers that no single moment of courage under fire ever could. It asked for patience sustained without reward or confirmation for the entire length of a war against a temptation that renewed itself every single day. And notice what this teaches about the deepest kind of advantage one side can hold over another in any contest built on prediction. You do not have to be stronger than your enemy to defeat his planning. You only have to deny him the pattern his planning depends on, consistently, even when doing so costs you something real and immediate in exchange for a benefit you will never be able to directly observe or measure. Fong's scouts watched a trail for a month and built a plan around what they saw. The plan failed not because the observation was wrong, but because the thing being observed had already, quietly, stopped being reliable by the deliberate choice of men willing to walk the longer way every single time, rather than let a pattern form at all. Fong spent 4 days preparing a killing ground for a patrol that never came, along a trail his own patient scouts had watched for a month and trusted completely. The patrol did not fail to appear by accident. It failed to appear because an entire unit, disciplined from the top down, had made a quiet, unglamorous, and exhausting choice not to be predictable day after day for as long as the war required it of them. That is why Viet Cong ambush teams feared the Americans who never walked the same trail twice. Not because they could not be found, because they could not be counted on to be found in the same place a second time. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with the story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet, exhausting discipline that prevented battles from ever happening at all, on both sides of the wire. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, an infantryman, a squad leader, anyone who walked those trails in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.